We're continuing in our study on the prayers of people in trouble. And we're going to be looking at Psalm 25. It's been the theme of our worship today. I'll tell you, I'm probably not going to hit everything. I could probably preach a month of Sundays on this one psalm, trying to cover it all, and probably still even felt then. So as you go through it, there might be a part of it that you resonated with that I won't speak as much toward, and there might be a part of it that you didn't even notice that I speak too much on, but hopefully God will address all of it to us. I'm not sure if you are aware, but there is more written in the Bible about King David than any other biblical character. There are 66 chapters in the Old Testament that are dedicated to his life. And that does not include the 59 times that he's referred to in the New Testament, nor the 75 Psalms that are attributed specifically to him. He was a pivotal figure. He rose from the obscurity of being the youngest child in a rather large family who was out taking care of the sheep, to the prominence of being selected by Samuel, by God's guidance and inspiration, to be the king of Israel, and all the struggles that went from one extreme to the other. He was the one who was willing to put his faith in God in the terms of action and behavior and obedience, when even those who claimed that they loved God were unwilling to actually step out in faith. You know, we look to him not because of his perfect example, but because of his insistence that God truly is the God of love and grace and mercy, the one who created this world, and we need to be following him. That's why his life and his words were not such only a huge impact to people way back when, but they're still influencing us today who seek and follow God. Psalm 25 that we've looked at through song, and we've looked at in our communion devotion and our prayers, is one of David's songs. It's a rather complex one. One in which David admits his need for forgiveness and his need to be protected, as well as his need to be directed. It is not from one that we should just sing only one verse of. You know, there are some songs that we sing today that we only know the first verse to, or especially those Christmas songs that we've been enjoying. You get to sing those second and third verses, and people are going like, what song is this? I've never heard these words before. And we don't want to be that way with David's psalm. Each of those stanzas are just like different verses in it. And we want to hear the entirety, embrace the whole narrative that's being told in this psalm. So in preparing with this, I am going to talk about all those different things, but I'm not going to just do it from top to bottom, but I'm going to address each of the things that David brought up. When I was preparing to share with you this morning, I don't know how many times I've read through this psalm, a lot more than I ever have before. I stopped and paused and looked over the words that David used, tried to look at them in the language that he spoke them in, trying to avoid the temptation of trying to address what my personal issues are, and trying to capture the issues that David was dealing with in this beautiful expression of his faith. He didn't go into any specific details that can be used to pinpoint a specific episode in his life, as some of his other psalms do. But he does reveal enough that it seems that he composed this particular song when he felt the pressure to give up on God, as so many others in his kingdom had done, while keeping hold onto what God does and always seem like the right thing to do, because it doesn't seem like God is doing anything for our troubles. David insisted on holding on to him in the midst of his oppositions. David just simply couldn't bring himself of giving up on God. Sort of like Peter. You remember Peter, whenever Jesus asked the disciples that had been following him if they wanted to follow the crowds. I don't know if you remember, but there was a time in Jesus' life where the crowds were starting to say, man, we like that you're healing us, but we don't really like what you're starting to disclose about yourself. I mean, you're saying you're God's son. You're saying you're the Messiah. You're claiming that you can forgive sins, and we're having trouble with that. And not only the opposition of the leaders, but even the crowds begin to turn away from Jesus. And Jesus looks at his disciples and he says, do you want to go too? Do you want to abandon me as well? And it was Peter who said, but to whom shall we go? You have the words of life. And David seems to be expressing that in this song. Even though there are others that are turning away and he's feeling the pressure to do the same thing, but he's like, where else would I go? Who else would I turn to? There were certainly lots of options, just as we have a lot of options today. I want you to pay especially attention to the personal pronouns. This was at first a very personal song for David before it became a congregational song. He says, to you alone, O Lord, I lift up my soul. Oh my God. He's not speaking for anyone else. In you I trust. Don't let me be ashamed. Don't let my enemies exult over me. These opening words are nothing short than a personal declaration of David's complete devotion to God and God alone, while also expressing his fear of what might happen for doing so. You know, it's not always an easy road to follow God. Jesus said the way is narrow, it's tough, it's a hard road if you're going to follow me. And most people don't choose to do so. They would much rather be on a wider, easier path. Sometimes we think of evangelism that way. If we could just tell people who Jesus is and showing the path of following Jesus, everybody's going to want to do that. But when you really start seeing where Jesus is headed, you start seeing the path that he's following, how narrow it is, how difficult it is, the opposition that you encounter, the enemies that you create. There are a lot of people who are saying, I'm not so sure I really want to follow this road. Hey, Jesus, I thought your way was going to be big. I thought it was going to be easy. Man, I thought it's just going to be a wonderful thing. You know, when you tell people, hey, come follow Jesus, and people are going to hate you. People are going to oppose you. They're going to make your life miserable. Come follow Jesus. You don't hear that a lot in church. When we talk about our undivided, total devotion to God, no matter what comes our way, about our dependence upon him and him alone, we're talking about our trust, our faith. We're talking about he really will take care of us. And that he will do whatever it is that we need, whether it's protection or provision or pardon or even punishment. Trusting God for David was not sort of saying what I hear a lot of people saying, whatever happens, happens. You hear people saying that? I hear a lot of people just saying, yeah, whatever it is what's going to happen, so we'll just go on. That's not what David says in this song. He acknowledges that God is in control of what happens. And he can change things if that's God's will to do so. And we turn to him when we follow him because he specializes in doing what we can barely imagine. It's this sort of trust that drew the crowds after Jesus. They were facing troubles, physical ailments, demon possessions, whether they knew it or not, that nobody could address. They had prayed and they had gone to the physicians. They had done everything they could. Nothing was getting better. And then they heard about this Jesus guy who was making the impossible happen. And they thought, well, maybe the normal doesn't have to happen for me. The normal of my hurt, the normal of my pain, the normal of my troubles. Maybe I can turn to Jesus and he can make it all go away. And so they came to him, hoping, trusting that the impossible would happen instead of the normal continuing. You see, trusting God is our part of the equation in our relationship with him. It's God who does the heavy lifting of bringing about the change in our life situations and circumstances. And we have to come to terms with the fact that we're not surprising God with anything. He's well aware of disease and disappointment and disabilities and death, all that defiles this good creation and cripples his creatures because of Adam's and Eve's decision to trust the lie instead of remaining obedient to him. He is also well aware that the same temptation they faced is also set before us, and that we often, like them, listen to the lies and let them influence us instead of trusting what God has originally revealed and told to us. Waiting for God to do the impossible in his time and in his way at just the right time, allowing his unfailing love to break through and lift us up, to move us along in our walk with God, to prepare us that we can continue with him into eternity is not always an easy thing to do. Sometimes we don't think he's ever going to do it, so we give up. Tell you, one of the good things I do, and I certainly don't do it as often as I should, I need to do it even more than I do, it is to simply call on believers who are in times of trouble. There's one particular person in our congregation, I'm not going to use the name, but I end up talking to this person fairly frequently and for long periods of time. The last time I was out walking my dog in the evening, I usually walk about 40-45 minutes. Started talking to him at the beginning of that walk and didn't finish until it was over. But I always get encouraged by this person. They were talking about, just like David was, saying, man, I got all of these things happening in my life and I don't know what to do. But I know that if I just keep waiting, God's going to help me in the end. He's done it in the past, and he's going to do it again. But I'm in that point where I'm waiting for him, and I'm struggling. I'm struggling on just waiting for God to do his part. Waiting, trusting God to keep his promise. By the end of the call, I hope that they were encouraged, but I tell you what, I was more encouraged, especially after going through this psalm all week. Yes, there are consequences to our sin which we may be held accountable for. Whether that be something that we have commissioned, that is, we have decided in rebellion to do, or something that we just failed to do, or we omitted to do. It could be that we are impacted by the sin of others, that we are a victim, or maybe even the collective sin of our society as it turns further away from God and dissolves into a joyous celebration of Satan's ways. But we can, with God, be lifted up above the consequences of this life, despite the hardships of dealing with the consequences. I remember Adam and Eve, and we look forward to being in that place as they did. You know, they started out in a perfect place. They were with God, where everything was perfect. And then they listened to the lie and they acted on the lie. And then they had to live a life that was full of consequences of their sin. But they lived good lives. They had to encounter disease and death, division, even their own children fighting one another, killing one another. But God saw them through it and began to bring about his goodness into a very fallen world with all of its consequences. Our trust in God in this fallen world is evidenced most often by our obedience to his ways, despite the lies and the oppositions, our willingness to do what he asks us to do, not because we have to, not because we're just trying to get other people to see how good we are, but because we trust him. We really believe that what he says and what he has revealed to us really is the right and best way to live. We trust him, and so we do it. That's why, like David saying in this psalm, we commit ourselves to learning his word so that we might not, as he said in other psalms, sin against God. We want to know his ways even better. Not so that we can pass some test, but so that we can put it into practice and we can be better at doing what is right. Of course, we're still going to get off track. We may still get lost along the way. But with this clear roadmap that God has given us, with his Spirit prompting us, we're going to get to our destination. And when I say roadmap, I include that modern convenience of a GPS, right? Most of us don't know what a map is. We just sort of hit in what's near me, and it gets us there. And we just follow those directions. Well, I just want you to understand that God's Word is God's positioning system. It is global, but it's more godly than global. And wherever you're at in your life and you're wanting to get some other destination, you can put in there, God, where is this near me? And he's going to get you there. You're still going to have to follow the directions. You're going to have to be obedient to them. And if you're like me, you'll probably hear more often than you want to hear, recalculating. Because I've gone off somewhere the wrong direction. God's going to get me back to the right place. That's kind of what we hear in David's psalm today. He doesn't want to be off course. He doesn't want to hear recalculating. He's heard it too much in the past. He knows where that's at. It's a lonely place. And he wants to be back right with God. He wants to be at that point where he's helping others, helping himself follow God's ways and reaping the benefits of it, even in a fallen world. At one point in the church, we sang some old songs. In fact, there's a part of me that really enjoyed the song that we sang earlier, this new song from Bob's high school days. New is probably not the right word, but it is fresh for us. And so enjoyed that. But there was a time when the church started saying with gusto, trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus but to trust and obey. Now, there are a lot of people who are new to the church who are probably saying, man, I've never heard that my whole life. Where would that come from? But for those of us who sort of grown up in the church now or spent a lot of years, we know exactly where that came from. But pretty more often in the modern church, we sort of leave off the obey part. Obey has become a 4-letter word for us. We want the blessings of God, the intervention of God, but we want to live life our own way. Thank you very much, God. We want to take your word and we want to massage it and change it and allow it to express what we want, despite what it is that you so clearly expressed in it. If you took your GPS and you said, I want to go to this location, and it gave you a list of things, you're going like, well, I know you gave me all these directions to get there, but, I really don't like turning left, and so we're not going to do that. We're just not going to be turning any left here. I really don't like driving on this street here, so I want to drive on this other street because this other street is really where I want to be. But I still want you to get me to the right location, but I want to drive on this other street. I know people could come in and say, I don't know why I'm struggling. Maybe it's about obedience. Maybe you're not obeying. You're saying that you trust God, but you're not obeying Him. It's imperative. Despite the lies we tell ourselves, it's imperative to obey. Otherwise, Jesus would not have commissioned his disciples to make more disciples by teaching them to obey all that he has commanded. But before our obedience comes that trust, which is essential. Our devotion to God must be primary, and so appropriately, David certainly begins the psalm with this declaration first and foremost of his complete devotion to God, but it shows up again and again and again through this psalm. Just as his cry for forgive me, pardon me, forgive me is also there. There is no one else to whom David can lift up his soul. or before whom he can lay it down. It doesn't say that in the translation that we read earlier, but the Hebrew word translated trust actually means to lie extended on the ground. We might think of this behavior as one of worship, because we often hear about worship from the New Testament, which is based on a Greek word, and the Greek word for worship does mean to lay down on the ground. The Greeks had a different word for trust, pisteuo. One that meant exactly what this same Hebrew that meant to lay on the ground meant. To believe, to trust, to have faith. To be totally devoted to someone in the sense that you were willing to just give everything to them and their whole prominence over you, to obey them. We've seen what seems to have troubled David was the fear of being shamed for trusting God. David did not want God to allow anything to happen to him that result in his enemies rejoicing because they had been victorious in some way over him. He wasn't talking about a battle that he had particularly had, a particular conflict when he was carrying the sword. Some might question, though, that whether David's request was based on a proper understanding of God's promises. Had God ever promised to make David invincible? After experiencing so many back-to-back victories, David probably had thought so at some point. But then again, David, by this point in his life, probably also knew the agony of defeat. By the time he wrote this psalm, he knew it was possible for him to lose a battle at the hands of his enemies, even though he was trusting God to give the overall victory. We often wonder whether God is really at work whenever the opposition seems to be doing well and we seem to be doing poorly. When bad things happen instead of good things. The truth is, on occasion, bad things really do happen to good people. Just ask Job, right? That's sort of where we go to in the church. His example. Unfortunately, whenever bad things do happen, we do often end up blaming God for those bad things. We become disappointed with him because of our own unrealistic expectations. We feel that God is breaking the promise that we have made with him. God, I promise I'm going to go to church every week. And just by the way, if you're wondering, we have plenty of room here on Sunday morning. In fact, we can have a Bring a Friend Sunday and still not worry about what the governor said about attendance here. And so, if you guys want to show up, come and join us. We got room for you. But there are some people who make those kinds of mental things, saying, God, I'll be there. I'll have my family with you there. Just don't let my wife leave me. And then they end up getting a divorce. And they pull away from the church because they say, God, you just didn't take care of me and my family. I was going to church. Of course, they were probably also running around or doing all these other things that led to the divorce. God hates divorce because it's the culmination of sin. And he hates sin. He doesn't want us to live a life like that. We make all kinds of deals with God. And whenever it doesn't work out for us, we blame him. David knew better. He knew that, like Job, he might have to wait. He might even have to endure some of the consequences of his own sin while he was waiting. He might have to suffer. He might have to be alone. Although David doesn't talk about this psalm, even his friends might turn against him, as they did with Job. But he could trust that God would keep God's promises to us. He might not hold to what we want him to do, but he is going to hold to his promises. David knew that if he was ever truly defeated, it would really be his own fault, not God's. Even so, David didn't want to put things on his own ability to do what was right. Now, he wanted to do what was right. He wanted to be taught what was right. He was the sinner who needed to be instructed in God's ways. He wants to be victorious. But it's hard to have those enemies who seem to be victorious when you're suffering. And they start looking at David and saying, you fool. You fool for trusting God. You should have come with us. Life would be a lot better. But like everyone else, David has to wait for God to do God's thing. Those who wait upon the Lord, as Isaiah said, renew their strength. That also means they go through a time when they don't have it. They will run and not grow weary, which means they go through times when they are just wore out. They will walk and they will not faint. They'll have a stamina that they didn't have on their own. God will give to them what they need in order to live God's way in this very fallen world. He will keep his promises. They will not be ashamed. But David does say at the first of the psalm, those who will be ashamed are those who deal treacherously. Now that's the translation we get in English. The Hebrew word from back there is really the word to break your faith. So those who wait upon the Lord, those who trust him, those who put their trust in him will be lifted up. But those who break their faith with God, those are the ones who are going to experience shame. Those are the ones who will suffer defeat at the hands of God in the end, not those who trust in him. The Hebrew translated enemy, because David was concerned about his enemies, actually is a word that means to be hostile toward. So he wasn't just talking about this national level. At this point, he had a lot of enemies. People, that is, who held resentments and jealousies, who felt threatened by him. Whatever it was that brought that anger up in their lives, it was churning away in them. Some was on a national level because he was the king. Some was on a personal level because of betrayals. There really were a lot of people, he says, who wanted to get even with him, who wanted to punish him for the things that they felt that he needed to be punished for. There were those who were so offended by him that they were compelled to do anything in opposition to him at every turn along the way. Whatever might have generated that anger, as it continued to churn inside of them, it compelled them to attack David. Well, we see a lot of that today, don't we? But David knew that his only hope against all these people who were angry with him was to double down on God, to learn his ways even better. Not only in regarding on how to deal with these people who hated him, but just living life for God in general. He would learn to wait upon the Lord. He says he would learn to fear the Lord alone. You know, when he talks about these different things, he's not talking about someone else. He's talking about himself. He's the sinner who needs to be instructed. He's the one who fears the Lord. We would learn to trust him, that he's not going to act like our enemies. Isn't that part of our trust in God? You know, God, he says, God, I don't want you keeping a record of wrongs. That's an echo of what we hear in 1 Corinthians 13. I don't want you plotting my demise, God. He would learn to trust that God would remember him in love rather than remembering him in anger. So David would continually look to the Lord. Man, who else to look to? Who else is going to always look at you in love? Who is always going to look at you in forgiveness? He would do so because he believed that God really is good. And that God would do what is right, not for David's sake, but for goodness' sake. Yet David was honest with himself that trusting and obeying while waiting upon the Lord just simply isn't easy. He knew that he didn't deserve God's protection because he had sinned against God. So he worried about, maybe I'm going to go through these tough times where my enemies might get to bring about those consequences in my life. He was stressed out over it. He was de-stressed over it. He couldn't help himself but being worried about it. What if they get the upper hand? What if he gets what he deserves? He starts to listen to that worldly lie, but he cries out for God's protection. God, man, take away all these fears from me. Let me put my trust in you. Settle me down. Man, you watch the news. You watch all those emails and those posts and all this kind of stuff, you'll get worked up. But we just need to turn to the Lord and say, okay, God, I'm going to quit listening to the world. and I'm going to start listening to you. I'm going to wait on you. David's saying how he couldn't do anything about how his enemies felt, but he could do something about how he was feeling. And the worst way he could do that is that he could confess and that he could repent of those sins. When we confess our sins, we're not telling God something he doesn't already know about us, and neither did David. We're finally agreeing with God about what he already knows about us. I'm going to harken back to Adam and Eve again, since I brought them up earlier. You remember whenever God shows up in the garden, they've already been deceived. They're already acting on the lies that Satan had given them. And God shows up and he just simply says, so what you wearing? Oh, these old rags? Well, why are you wearing them? We're naked. Oh, really? Who told you that? Who's lying to you? You're believing that again. I think it's a good lesson because sometimes that's the way we are. We don't even realize that we've been influenced by the lies and that we're living and making choices in our life based on those lies rather than on God's truth. I'll be honest. Super Bowl's coming up, and I'm not very excited about it. This has not been a season where I've watched any of the teams, even the ones I like. But they're still going to probably spend millions of dollars for a 15, 20, 30-second clip. Why do they spend so much money on that? Because it influences people to change their behavior, even in that little bit of time. Now, the behavior they're wanting to get is to buy their product or to visit them or something like that. But it just goes to show that we're sort of gullible. We are influenced by the world. And we get to the point that we start believing and thinking the world's way, and we bring that thinking right into the church, and it's a disaster. We need to think God's way. You see, sometimes God has to bring and drag that out of us to make us aware, just like he was doing with Adam and Eve. But as he does it, he's patient with us. And he instructs us, just as he instructed them. He reminds us of his covenant as he goes through it. Yeah, you've done wrong. Remember, I love you. I'm going to forgive you. I'm going to bring about my will. He rescues us, plucks our feet out of the snare that Satan has laid for us, that we're caught in. He leads us. But he really doesn't lead us until we reach that point that we can be led. We're humble. He gets us back on the path. What path? It says in here. I want to say path of righteousness, but he gives us a greater definition of it. He says the path of loving kindness and truth. And part of the process for that to happen in our lives is to let God forgive us, to pardon our sin, no matter how great they be, and we cry out for that. David was committed to trusting God, who would do what is right because it is right, and he would do it right for him, just as he'll do it right for you. He could pray for, and then he could wait for God's deliverance, and he knew it wouldn't happen just for him, but his whole nation could enjoy that if they would just turn to him. Just because trusting God sounds simple doesn't make it easy. But there's no substitute for trusting God to do his part. And there is no substitute for us doing our part. We trust him and we obey him. How good it must have been for David to say, this has been the experience of my life with God. And when we come together as his people and we worship God together, let's use this psalm to remind ourselves of this great, compassionate, loving God who will lead us even when we struggle, even when we hurt, even when we claim our devotion. Man, we're just trying to get there. It's good to be reminded of the truths that God is one who is for us and not against us. We're going to have a hymn of invitation. If you need redemption, protection, provision, or even correction, we ask that you turn to God and you let Him bring about His promises, keeping them in your life. Would you please stand?